Please note that in the YouTube description we have links to Discord, Patreon, and the sources that I referenced to be able to make this video. Augustin-Louis Cauchy was a 19th century French mathematician, engineer, and physicist. He was pivotal in his contributions to mathematical analysis, primarily in the complex plane, extending this theory to mechanics, and he was a leading figure in making mathematics more rigorous. Cauchy had great influence on those around him and those who came after, despite many people's distaste for him as a person. And his research output was gargantuan, being only second to Euler, having published about 800 research papers and a few textbooks on mathematics and physics. Cauchy was born on August 21st, 1789 in Paris. His parents were Louis-François Cauchy, who was initially a high official of the Parisian police of the ancient regime, and Marie-Madeleine de Sestre, a woman that was born into a wealthy political family, which was quite a contrast from Louis-François, who was not well off. Cauchy was the oldest of three boys, his brothers being Alexandre Laurent, born in 1791, who pursued the role of a justiciary, and Eugene François, born in 1803, who was a publicist and also wrote a few mathematical works. Cauchy was born at a rather inopportune time, being born a month before the French Revolution broke out, which led to his father losing his position and honestly fearing for his and his family's safety. Just before the Reign of Terror broke out, the family moved to Exile, which was about 50 kilometers south of Paris. It was a rough time living there as food was apparently scarce. Cauchy also got smallpox and had trouble adjusting to the stressful conditions the move had thrown them into. After the Paris executions took place, the family returned to Paris in July of 1794, living in Rue du Trône. After returning to Paris, Louis-François continued to educate Cauchy, and started educating Alexandre Laurent as he was now old enough, teaching them grammar, history, religion, ethics, and later Latin and Greek, having them study the works of ancient writers. In 1800, Louis-François obtained a bureaucratic position that he quickly climbed the ranks in, working under Pierre-Simon Laplace, whom he ultimately befriended, as well as befriending Joseph-Louis Lagrange. It was around this time that Cauchy began gaining an interest in mathematics, which intrigued Lagrange greatly, recognizing Cauchy's innate mathematical genius. He advised that Louis-François get Cauchy a strong foundation in languages before Cauchy started getting even more serious about his mathematical studies. Louis-François took this to heart and enrolled Cauchy into the École Centrale du Panthéon in 1802, which, at the time, was the best secondary school in Paris. Most of the curriculum centered around classical language, and Cauchy ended up winning many prizes while at this institution. Despite this success, he really only wanted to pursue something at least mathematically adjacent. His father initially wanted him to pursue the study of law, but was incredibly supportive when Cauchy decided against this. In 1804, Cauchy began preparing for the entrance exam to get into the École Polytechnique, attending math courses taught by Charles-Louis Denet, professor at Lycée Napoléon, which is what École Centrale du Panthéon turned into from 1804 to 1816, and an examiner at École Polytechnique. In 1805, Cauchy took the exam to get in, coming in second of 125 to be admitted. Under Napoleon's rule, Cauchy had to choose a field of public service he wanted to enter after going through university, to which Cauchy chose civil engineering. He also had to partake in military activity for his time at École Polytechnique, which Cauchy had great trouble adjusting to, given the comforts most of his upbringing had provided. In 1807, Cauchy graduated from École Polytechnique at age 18, moving on to École des Ponts et Chaussées to really focus on civil engineering. During his time there, he helped work on the Ourcq Canal, a project that had begun in 1802 per Napoleon's orders, and his mathematical talents, particularly in that of geometry, seemed to cause envy from his professors. Cauchy graduated with honors in 1810 and left having won 4 first-place prizes in various competitions he took part in while attending. After graduating, Cauchy got his first job in February of 1810, working as a junior engineer in Cherbourg, focusing on the construction of a naval base per Napoleon's wishes. He stayed on the project for 3 years, taking on more and more responsibility throughout that time, and even worked on other projects, which included working on shelters and prisons and the Saint-Cloud Bridge. To give a bit more insight into Cauchy's responsibility, he basically climbed the ranks to the point of giving direction for everything on the job site, including supervising teams of men, making executive decisions, dealing with the general hardships of a job site, and enduring whatever weather was thrown at him and his men. He was also tutoring students, spending hours at his desk reading books and papers on engineering, and learning to navigate his way through polite society, trying to increase his charisma. This amount of work sounds like it would leave no room for anything, yet Cauchy still found the energy and time to produce mathematical work. He submitted 3 manuscripts to premier class of the Institut de France. His first manuscript proved that angles of a convex polyhedron are determined by its faces, and his second paper extended upon this work, and both these papers were accepted without issue. The third work, which was rejected for whatever reason, studied directrices of conic sections. Not surprisingly, the years Cauchy spent with this incredibly potent schedule indeed led to mental fatigue, and in September of 1812, he left Cherbourg on a 6-month leave to mentally recover in his parents' home after a visit from his mother got her fairly concerned. Cauchy was also losing interest in engineering, wanting to focus more and more on producing mathematics, an opportunity that was much more likely to arise in Paris than in Cherbourg. During Cauchy's downtime, he wrote 2 memoirs on symmetric functions, both of which he presented to premier class in November of 1812, and yielded the calculus of substitutions. He also produced work in combinatorial theory that led him to yield the principal properties of determinants, greatly influenced by studying Gauss's arithmetic investigations. After Cauchy's mental health improved, he opted out of going back to Cherbourg to stay in Paris. He initially tried to become an associate professor at Pont-et-Chaussée, but was turned down. Luckily, in February of 1813, Cauchy was able to transfer back to the Ourcq Canal project since his previous work on it was so good. Of course, he much preferred the idea of obtaining an academic post, so he was still applying as positions opened, such as to the Bureau des Longitudes and the geometry section of Première Classe, both of which he got rejected from. Due to his growing distaste for engineering work, in June of 1813, Cauchy requested and was granted another 6 months of unpaid medical leave, which was actually extended another 3 months per his father's request. Luckily for Cauchy, political events blocked work on the canal by the time his leave was up, allowing him to fully dive into mathematical research for the next few years. During this time, Cauchy tried being admitted into Première Classe, being denied in favor of other mathematicians each of the 3 times he applied. In regard to his research during this time, he covered topics like symmetric groups, the theory of higher-order algebraic equations, and complex function theory, work that he sent to Première Classe in 1814, but wasn't published until 1825. This would prove to be his most important work. The 1814 memoir on complex analysis was revolutionary, allowing for previously impossible calculations to be done with absolute ease. The weight of his mathematical contribution wasn't immediately recognized, though it was heavily endorsed by other mathematicians. It's speculated that this is probably due to the reasons Cauchy stated for writing the memoir, viewed as twofold and mundane. He was trying to explain why the value of an iterated integral might be different depending on the order in which individual integrations are performed. And he wished with the work to put a cork in the generality of algebra, making the integration more rigorous, hoping to rid mathematics of the laissez-faire tricks to solving integrals using complex numbers that, for example, Euler had used. A notable result of the paper was Cauchy's first integral theorem, which states that if f of z is analytic in some simply connected region R, or closed contour, then the integral over that path will be 0. Gauss discovered this in 1811, writing, "This is a beautiful theorem whose simple proof I shall give on a suitable occasion," which he didn't, so Cauchy beat him to the punch in the memoir. While exploring the contour integral around a closed rectangular path of size AB for f of z equal to e to the negative z squared, Cauchy didn't leverage this theorem. He knew the result would yield 0, but he wanted to break up the integral and evaluate its non-zero pieces, as that was where the truly interesting complex study resided. Another result, probably the most notable of the paper, was Cauchy's second integral theorem, known as Cauchy's integral formula. The initial question that led to this theorem was basically, what happens if we integrate a complex function f of z around a contour that contains singularities? The theorem is stated as follows. Suppose C is a simple closed curve, and f of z is an analytic function in a region containing C, as well as its interior, with C oriented counterclockwise. Then, for any z0 inside C, f of z0 equals 1 divided by I 2 pi multiplied by the contour integral of f of z divided by z minus z0 dz. This essentially expresses that an arbitrary point z0 is completely determined by just the values of f of z along the boundary edge C. It also showed that differentiation is basically equivalent to integration in complex analysis, and can be used to derive Cauchy's differentiation formula. In March of 1816, after the fall of Napoleon, the Académie des Sciences was reestablished. The Bourbon dynasty was now in power under Louis XVIII, who shared many of the same conservative views as Cauchy, and people were let go from École Polytechnique due to political differences. With these new vacancies, Cauchy was able to finally get a non-engineering position, becoming an assistant professor of analysis. Later in 1816, Cauchy's mathematical notoriety, which had already been rising rapidly, got even stronger after winning the Grand Prix of the Academy. He won the prize for his work on waves, expanding on Fresnel's wave theory and the dispersion and polarization of light. He also proved Fermat's polygonal number theorem, which states that every positive integer can be written as the sum of at most n n-gon numbers. In 1817, Jean-Baptiste Biot, an 18th and 19th century French physicist and mathematician, notable for his contributions to electricity and magnetism, left for the Shetland Islands and Scotland, leaving his post at the Collège de France open. Cauchy filled this vacancy, lecturing on original methods of integration he produced in his research but hadn't published at the time. In 1818, Cauchy got married to a woman named Aloïse de Biot, the daughter of a man who published most of Cauchy's works. The wedding was quintessential Catholic and took place in the church of Saint-Sulpice. The pair stayed together till the day Cauchy died, and they had two daughters, Marie-Françoise Alicia and Marie Mathilde. Over the next few years, Cauchy continued to thrive mathematically and politically, especially when Charles X came to power in 1824. In 1821, Cauchy wrote a book titled Cours d'analyse, designed for students at École Polytechnique, which developed basic theorems of calculus as rigorously as possible. This work introduced the world of calculus to the first rigorous proof of Taylor's theorem, which established the well-known form of the remainder, and the development of the necessary and sufficient conditions for the existence of a limit, presenting the delta-epsilon method. In 1826, Cauchy published on a new kind of calculus analogous to infinitesimal calculus, which expanded upon the work he presented to Premier Classe on complex analysis in 1814, formally defining what a residue of a function is and introducing his residue theorem. To speak about it somewhat intuitively, if a complex function has any singularities, these singularities bring about a non-zero contribution called its residue. A residue can be viewed as what is left after you have removed all holomorphic parts of a function's domain. Pierre-Alphonse Lagrange, a 19th century French mathematician, helped expand upon this theory in the 1840s, creating the Lagrange series, extending Taylor's sum to include negative values in the index. The negative 1th term of the series yields the residue of our function. Sadly, despite Cauchy writing about Lagrange's work and pushing to get the work published, Lagrange's work was published posthumously. In 1829, Cauchy published Lessons on Differential Calculus, which introduced the world to the definition of a complex function of a complex variable. All the comforts Cauchy had been experiencing under Bourbon Rule came to a screeching halt in July of 1830, when the July Revolution occurred. Charles X fled France, and a non-Bourbon king, Louis Philippe, came to power. Besides being fearful of the riots raging near his home, Cauchy was struck with great fear and anxiety witnessing the fall of his beloved conservative government. His deep-seated hatred for liberals, which most probably stemmed from witnessing his father's loss of work and general political problems growing up, led to Cauchy fleeing France, leaving all of his academic posts and his family behind. Cauchy first traveled to Fribourg, Switzerland, originally intending for this trip to be short and then return to Paris. But Louis-Philippe imposed a law that required an oath of allegiance to the new regime that France was under, to which Cauchy deeply resented. With Cauchy refusing to take the oath, he lost all of his academic posts except for his membership to the Academy, which didn't care about the oath. In 1831, Cauchy traveled to Turin, Italy, accepting an offer from the King of Scandinavia for the chair in theoretical physics, which he'd created specifically for Cauchy, and he spent the next 2 years teaching there. In 1831 and 1832, Cauchy was elected as a foreign member to the Royal Swedish Academy of Sciences, as well as being elected as a foreign honorary member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. In August of 1833, Cauchy moved to Prague, and was finally reunited with his family in 1834 when they decided to move from Paris to be with Cauchy. During this time in Prague, Cauchy tutored the grandson of Charles X, named Baudu Henri d'Artois. Cauchy, who was a rather terrible lecturer, didn't have much success trying to teach Henri, who also wasn't that interested in mathematics. Cauchy would often get frustrated and start yelling at Henri, to which Henri's mother would calmly tell Cauchy to lower his voice. In September of 1838, Henri turned 18, and Cauchy stopped tutoring him. And it was at this point that it didn't make much sense to continue living in Turin, especially with Cauchy's lack of research productivity he'd experienced over the 5 years he tutored Henri. So the Cauchy family moved back to Paris in late 1838, where Cauchy returned to his position at the Academy, but was unable to teach as he still refused to take Louis-Philippe's oath. Before we continue, it's best to discuss the general unease, or even disdain people felt towards Cauchy. He was viewed as remarkably pretentious, and his conservative and pious views angered many of his peers. The majority acknowledged how important his work was and how brilliant a mathematician he was, but many wanted nothing to do with him personally. This began as early as his engineering days. He climbed the ranks remarkably fast, but his ability to interact with peers was stressful because he pushed his pious views so aggressively. People would still speak with him, but they made it a point to steer clear of any religious or political topics. When Cauchy took his medical leave and tried time and again to apply to academic posts, but failed, he was voted against in favor of someone, even if lacking the mathematical talent Cauchy had, who pushed their views less aggressively. The fact that he was also an avid supporter of the conservative Bourbon dynasty didn't really gain him many fans in academia, as most academics hated the conservative government that was put in place after Napoleon lost power. As is the nature with being pretentious, Cauchy could be quite rude to colleagues. In 1820, he criticized the work on projective geometry done by Jean-Victor Poncelet, a 19th century French mathematician and engineer, most notable for his work on projective geometry. Poncelet remarked that Cauchy was very rude when confronted, telling Poncelet to check out one of his soon-to-be published works, where the question would be very properly explored. In 1826, Niels Abel, a 19th century Norwegian mathematician, most notable for proving that it was impossible to solve algebraically for the general equation of a fifth-degree polynomial, visited the French Academy, having a rather unsavory interaction with Cauchy. Abel essentially commented that Cauchy was insane, but was the only one who knew how mathematics should be done. Abel also found a counterexample to one of Cauchy's propositions. And so, with the insanity comment and Cauchy hating being wrong, this probably caused Cauchy to not be a huge fan of Abel. Cauchy being rather petty, he put off writing a report of one of Abel's papers until Abel's death in April 1829, publishing a rather mean report about 2 months later. There were certainly other instances over the next few years, but in this final example, we'll jump to 1850. In this year, the chair of mathematics at the Academy opened up again. Cauchy and Joseph Liouville, a 19th century French mathematician and engineer, most notable for his work on transcendental numbers, were the prime candidates for filling the chair. The vote was unanimously against Cauchy, which made him furious. He went as far as trying to reverse the decision of Liouville gaining the chair, which ruined any kind of positive relationship Cauchy could have had with him. All this being said, Cauchy wasn't necessarily a bad person. He just had really strong views and didn't seem to have very strong emotional intelligence, leading to a lot of negative and petty interactions. In November of 1839, Cauchy was elected into the Bureau des Longitudes, as the Bureau didn't care about the oath. However, Louis-Philippe refused to approve of the election without the oath, putting Cauchy in a weird spot for years, as this meant he was never officially appointed to the Bureau. The consequences of this were that he didn't get paid, he couldn't attend meetings, and he couldn't submit research papers. Despite the hardships this brought on, Cauchy stood his ground and still spit on Louis Philippe's oath. He also still did research, largely on celestial mechanics, that he presented to the French Academy in 1840. In 1843, just 4 years after joining the Bureau, Cauchy was replaced by French mathematician and physicist Louis Poinsot, most notable for being the inventor of geometrical mechanics. Until Louis Philippe's fall from power in 1848, Cauchy's research was lacking, even more so than when he was in exile. He did, however, manage to produce research on differential equations, alongside his work in celestial mechanics, leading him to publish a very important work titled Analysis and Mathematical Physics Exercises, which he dedicated his time to between 1840 and 1847. Once Louis Philippe was overthrown in 1848, a conservative government came to power again. This scrapped the oath Cauchy had resisted for so many years, and allowed Cauchy to claim all of the university positions he'd lost during this period. Over the next few years, Cauchy continued to do mathematics research, rather comfortably, despite any feuds he found himself in. And in 1857, Cauchy fell ill due to some sort of bronchial condition, which resulted in his death on May 23, 1857, at the age of 67. According to one of his daughters, he was apparently quite lucid until just a half an hour before his death. Well, there you have it. A brief history of yet another prolific mathematician. We'll end on a quote from Bruno Belhost's biography of Cauchy. Such an enormous scientific creativity is nothing less than staggering, for it presents research on all the then-known areas of mathematics. In spite of its vastness and rich multifaceted character, Cauchy's scientific works possess a definite unifying theme, a secret wholeness. Cauchy's creative genius found broad expression not only in his work on the foundations of real and complex analysis, areas to which his name is inextricably linked, but also in many other fields. Specifically, in this connection, we should mention his major contributions to the development of mathematical physics and to theoretical mechanics. We mention his two theories of elasticity and his investigations on the theory of light, research which required that he develop whole new mathematical techniques, such as Fourier transforms, diagonalization of matrices, and the calculus of residues. If you enjoyed the video, please click that like button and subscribe. And if you generally just enjoy the content of this channel, please consider supporting on Patreon. As always, thank you for watching, and I'll catch you next time.